going, and welcome back to another episode of Mood for Feud. I'm your host Katia, and today we're taking it a little bit old school. We're going to be diving into the band Oasis, but more specifically the two brothers who were very much at the forefront of it, Liam and Noel Gallagher, who have had an extensive sibling feud. Probably it started when they were born, but in the public eye at least it started in 1991, and it has continued all the way through to the present day. I don't think the brothers have ever reconciled properly, as far as I can tell anyway. And yeah, I have to say this episode was probably one of the more relatable feuds. This sounds bad, and let me just explain what I mean by that. But I think especially if you do have siblings or family members that you're really close with, you do understand the way that they can just push your buttons harder than anybody else in your life can. With just a specific look, my sister can pull up this deep-seated rage within me that I'm not even aware is there. I always think I'm such a chill and easygoing person, and then my sister will look at me a certain way and I'm like, oh my god, I am the spawn of Satan. The amount of rage I feel right now is ungodly. So I think in that sense I found their feud quite relatable, because it is just that sibling rage that they pull out of one another. But we're gonna get all into that in a minute. I just want to, as always, thank you guys so much for listening and tuning in each week so that I can cover the celebrity feuds that I'm always in the mood for. I just have so much fun connecting with you guys over pop culture and stuff, and yeah, it honestly means a lot to me. If you haven't done so already, please do rate the podcast. You can do that either on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. If you've got some nice words you want to send my way, words of affirmation is my third love language. So, the first one's quality time. So you guys are already fulfilling that by being here with me today. I do like my words of affirmation. So yeah, leave me a review on Apple Podcasts if you can, and don't forget to follow the show so you never miss an episode, and follow me on Instagram, okay? Because my goal for 2024 is to get a couple more guests onto my podcast, and there's definitely other pop culture podcasters that I love and I definitely want on my show, but I am self-conscious, okay? And your girl's I'm not gonna approach them from an Instagram account that has less than 100 followers and looks like a burner account, okay? So if you want to hear some other voices on this podcast, give me a follow and I will make that happen. But anyway, aside from that, I hope you guys are all having a great week out there. I feel like I'm already 6 months deep into 2024. I don't know about you, but this January I've already had highs and lows and, this and that happening. So I hope you guys are all remembering to take time to relax and unwind where you can, because it is pretty hectic out there at the moment, it feels like, at least for me. Let me know if you're feeling the same way. But yeah, I hope that you can just take some time out and put your feet up, and yeah, you know what? You deserve it. I know for a fact that everyone listening to this podcast is a bad bitch and deserves some downtime every now and then. As always, let me know all of your thoughts on Instagram at Mood for Feud, and I hope you have fun listening. Okay, let's get into the Gallagher brothers, Liam and Noel. I always want to say Noel and Joel, and I think it's just because I want their names to rhyme, but their names are Liam and Noel. So if I accidentally say Joel in there, just ignore it, okay? But as you probably do know, Liam and Noel Gallagher are most known for being at the forefront of the British rock band Oasis. You might not know all of the Oasis songs, but I guarantee that you do know at least one of them, and that is, of course, Wonderwall. We've all been at a party, and you have that one drunk guy who happens to find a guitar and then insists on serenading you, and of course, it's always Wonderwall. And I'm not gonna lie, when I was watching the Barbie movie last year, and it got to that scene where they, the Kens start playing the guitar, I thought it was gonna be Wonderwall. Every bone in my body was like, oh, I know exactly where this is going. They're going to start playing Wonderwall. And then it was a different song, but the joke's all the same. But at least in my experience, let me know what your Wonderwall song was. But definitely in my experience, it was always Wonderwall. So that song does trigger me a little bit. But yeah, super, super famous British rock band. If you still have your dad in your life, now is a good chance to grab him and, listen to this episode with him. Or if you don't live in the same city as him, send him at Mood for Feud on text or email or whatever you use to communicate, because I have a feeling that Oasis is a band that had such a big impact on probably our parents' generation and not so much on our own. Or at least I'm speaking from my own experience here. I didn't know much about this band at all before I started looking into them. And then I was reading all these articles and there was documentaries and millions of interviews and people in the comments who I'm assuming are of an older generation saying how this was what got them into music, or this was the most iconic band of all time, or, they had posters of Oasis up. And so I feel like they did have this massive moment probably in the 90s that we just, at least if you're my age, that we would have missed out on. So, spark up a little convo. Maybe you can impress your dad with some Oasis facts after this and you'll be like, wow, kids these days aren't as uncultured as everybody says. But I actually had a great time researching this one. Oasis was wild. Don't let the name Oasis fool you, because they were not an oasis by any means. They were chaotic. They were absolutely unhinged, and they were, for lack of a better term, hooligans. They are your classic British, don't give a fuck, baddie type of energy where they will just live their life unapologetically, and if you have a problem with that, then you can go fuck yourself. They were very much that kind of energy. And I do find it funny that in a lot of British representation that you see, particularly in American media, British people are always portrayed as very hoity-toity and drinking tea and basically just a mini version of the royal family. But in my mind, at least, if you were to ask me to picture someone British, and I say this with absolute love, by the way, I would picture someone like Oasis. I would picture that kind of bad bitch, don't give a fuck energy style type of person. Yeah, as I mentioned up top, I think this feud is such a classic example of just the way that siblings can bring out the best but also the absolute worst in you. I did also enjoy just thinking about that kind of family dynamic, because Noel Gallagher is the older brother and he is the middle child in his family, but the older brother to Liam. And you can just tell, the way that they fight and the way that they argue and bicker. And Noel's always coming from this position of, I know so much more than you. I know the world in a way that you don't because you're just my little brother. And as an older sister myself, I can relate to having that kind of self-proclaimed wisdom where I do genuinely sometimes have a bit of a God complex, and I think that I just know so much more than those around me, and if everyone just listened to me and did things my way, no one would be getting into shit. And then you've got Liam, who to me is just the classic younger brother, hates being told what to do, couldn't give two shits about what Noel's telling him to do, and wants people to recognize that he is his own person and he's more than capable of looking after himself and making his own decisions, and he doesn't always need to listen to what Noel has to say. And so I think for that reason I found this really intriguing, and I'd love to know what your sibling dynamics are, or just dynamics with other family members if you don't have siblings that you're close to. Because birth order does always intrigue me, and I do think there are overlapping characteristics between people who are on the older end of their siblings and then people who are on the younger end. And I'm truly, truly fascinated by all of that kind of thing. So let me know if you also recognize elements of yourself in this feud. And then the last thing I will say before we get into things is that there is going to be mentions of drug use in this episode. Oasis was a very rock and roll type band, so if that's something that's triggering to you, and there's going to be mention of a little bit of violence. They definitely were known for getting into scraps and stuff, so just take care when you're listening. But let's start off with Noel Gallagher. So Noel Thomas David Gallagher was born on the 29th of May 1967, which makes him a Gemini. So Noel was born in Manchester, and he was born to an Irish family, and he had an older brother Paul, and then obviously a younger brother Liam. And I do always find it really fascinating when you have these families where there are siblings and some of them will be involved in like a band or something like that together, and then there's one that isn't. It's kind of like how you've got the Jonas Brothers and then you have Frankie Jonas, who just isn't part of that. Or even, you know, Chris and Liam Hemsworth are both pretty big actors, and then you've got, I want to say Tom, like I don't even know his name. I want to say Tom Hemsworth, who has also acted in things. I think he was in that robot show, Westworld? Yeah, I think it's called Westworld. But it's not the same, and I'm always like, how does that happen? And I'd love to sit them all in a room together and be like, why were you left out? Noel was described growing up as being a bit of a weirdo. He was a bit more recluse than the other brothers, and they often labelled him like a daydreamer and a loner. And I think this goes back to what I was saying. Like, I feel like the vibe that I've been catching from Noel watching some of his interviews and stuff, he was the songwriter behind Oasis. And I feel like when you have people like that who are constantly, you know, writing music in their head or writing lyrics down or just in that kind of poetic state of mind, they do tend to be a little bit more introvert sometimes because they're in their element and they know that what they've got going on in their head can actually translate into something really great, and so they don't mind reclusing a bit to focus on that or to tap into that. The Gallagher brothers' dad, Thomas, doesn't sound like he was the greatest person in the world. He wasn't alcoholic, so he was drunk quite a lot of the time, and trigger warning, but he would beat Paul and Noel quite frequently and just physically abuse the boys, you know, if they did the tiniest thing out of line, or probably even if they did nothing out of line. And so Paul and Noel actually did struggle with stammers in their speech, and I think that that was as a result of this physical abuse that they suffered under from their dad. I think they both went to speech therapy for it though, so it isn't as obvious now. Like, I certainly didn't really notice it that much in interviews that I watched, but that's pretty damn sad. In the documentary Supersonic, which was made about Oasis, Noel kind of lightheartedly quips that his dad literally beat the talent into him. Thankfully, in 1982, their mum does end up leaving Thomas, and so she takes her 3 sons with her and she raises them alone. And now I do want to give just a little context into what Manchester was like in the 1980s. The UK was very much defined by the Margaret Thatcher era, and part of Thatcher's policies, just FYI, I am not a history girly, okay? So if I get some of this stuff wrong. But I'm just trying to give you the vibe. Basically, I think a lot of Thatcher policies were looking into deindustrialization as well as trade union reforms, which were aimed at kind of curbing the power that trade unions had. And so especially in Manchester, this had a really big impact because it had such a heavy reliance on manufacturing industries, which obviously the deindustrialization era was, you know, resulting in there being a high industrial decline. A lot of these industries struggled, and so a lot of factories closed. And so as a result, a lot of the working class then became unemployed. And again, at the same time, trade unions were, you know, there was starting to be a bit of a power shift in how much trade unions were able to do. And so it did result in a lot of the working class people losing their jobs, and resulted in, particularly places like Manchester, in really high rates of unemployment. And a lot of people who were living in Manchester at the time would have been going through significant economic hardships. And so that's kind of the setting that the Gallagher brothers were. And I think that does become obvious in the way that they talk about their early childhood. And, you know, with a lot of unemployment, there always comes a lot of depression and a lot of mental health issues that I can guarantee you in the 80s nobody was talking about. And so this kind of sets the scene that Paul, Noel and Liam would have grown up in. And Noel recalls that he would quite regularly skip school from the ages 13 to 14, and the brothers were kind of, you know, they were truants. They would skip school quite frequently, and Noel recalls that from the age of 13 to 14, he would be out sniffing glue, doing psychedelic mushrooms, consuming a ton of alcohol, because he didn't want to go to school and there was just nothing really else to do. And his mum, Peggy Gallagher, did work at the school canteen at the time. And so what he would do is he'd just show up for lunch so that she would see his face at school every day, and then she wouldn't know that he was actually not going to any of his classes. And he also describes in an interview that his classes had 100 students in them, and so no one would really notice if he was going missing. Like, probably the only person who would notice that he wasn't there was his mum, which is why he always made sure to show face at the canteen so she wouldn't even know that he was sniffing glue in his downtime. But he does also say that while he was skipping school and doing all these drugs, he would also listen to a lot of music. So maybe that's where that passion for music began. Now, Noel was definitely getting into trouble with police quite frequently. And at 14 years old, he actually received a 6 months probation for robbing a dairy. And during this probation period, he obviously couldn't get up to too much. He decided to pick up the guitar, which was a gift from his mum, and he taught himself how to play the guitar. And I think this is where his joy for music, or his passion for songwriting, really kicked off, because into his teens, we see him continuing to prioritize music alongside whatever else he was doing. I think it was almost like a bit of an escapism for him. In his teen years, he worked in a construction company storehouse, and while he worked there, he was finding a lot of time to write music. And in the 1980s, he was actually unemployed for a while, and during this time, again, he was using a lot of recreational drugs, but also writing a lot of music. In 1988, Noel meets the guitarist for a band called Inspiral Carpets, and the two connect, and Noel becomes part of the band's road crew. So he actually tours America with Inspiral Carpets, working for them as a crew member, which again, he would have learnt so much about how bands work and, songwriting and music and just getting experience in the music industry. When Noel returns back to Manchester in 1991 from the America tour, he learns that Liam has since founded a band, and then this is kind of also when Oasis is formed, which I'll get into a little bit later. And Noel is the sole songwriter for Oasis. He has been credited as being one of the best songwriters in British music history, and Oasis, the band, has been credited with defining the Brit pop genre, along with other bands like Blur, Stone Roses, and The Verve. Noel is definitely musically talented. He was mostly known for playing guitar, but he is also proficient in playing the bass, piano, and drums as well. Later, after Oasis splits, spoiler alert if you didn't know that, he does start his own solo career, and I think that's what he's still doing to this day. So he is still writing songs and writing music and touring, but it's on his own solo career. It's not as part of Oasis or anything to do with his brother Liam. Now, moving on to William John Paul Gallagher. That is such an eloquent sounding name. But he did go by Liam Gallagher. He was born on the 21st of September 1972, so that makes him about 5 years younger than his brother Noel. And he is a Virgo. I think this might be our first Virgo. Correct me if I'm wrong. So that's exciting. We need some earth sign representation, although I don't know if Liam Gallagher is necessarily the representation that we want. Obviously, Liam also grew up in Manchester alongside Noel. He actually shared a room with Noel because obviously their mum was raising them by themselves. They didn't have a big enough house to each get their own bedroom, and so because Paul was the older brother, he got his own room, but then Noel and Liam had to share rooms. And honestly, I think this might actually be where the feud starts, because I can imagine that growing up with your brother in your room as a teenager will just result in arguments, fights, bickering, general annoyances. I truly think that this is part of the reason for why these two end up having such a deep-seated feud. There's an interview where Liam is recalling a story where he'd come home, he was super wasted on, alcohol and drugs and the like, and when he woke up, he really needed to go toilet, and he was like really disoriented, and the head was spinning, all that kind of stuff, and he was feeling around the walls trying to find the light switch, but he couldn't find it, so he was like, okay, I'm just gonna have to piss in the room. And so, he chooses a corner that's away from his bed, away from Noel's bed as well, and starts pissing, and the sound of it wakes Noel up, and he's like, what the fuck? And Liam was actually pissing on Noel's brand new sound system that he'd just purchased and set up in the room. And so obviously Noel was like furious by this. And in the story, you know, the interviewer asks Liam, "Did you apologize for that?" Because that would have been fucking annoying. And Liam's just like, "Yeah, I did apologize." I can't do his voice. I can't do the accent. But he's like, "Yeah, I did apologize. I said to him, look, mate, it was either into your open mouth or onto your stereo system, so pick what you want." Which isn't really an apology, is it? But that kind of just is a little preface, I guess, into the type of relationship that these two had. So Liam recalls that when he was initially growing up, he had zero interest in music. He was actually more into sports and he loved it and played a lot of it. He recalls that there was an incident where he was hit on the head by a hammer, which was wielded by someone who went to one of his rival schools, and that ever since he had the blow to the head from the hammer, he just completely changed his attitude towards music, and suddenly he started to love it. And he became quite interested in this idea that he wanted to start a band. And he loved the Beatles, and he found a big inspiration from John Lennon, and he grew more confident in becoming a singer and pursuing that line of work. He would also call himself the reincarnate John Lennon, which I don't think their birthday and date of death line up at all, but I think, yeah, he just drew so much inspiration, and I think he wanted to kind of be considered as great as John Lennon. And honestly, Liam is your classic youngest child vibes. He is an absolute menace. He hates being controlled, hates being told what to do. You know, he really does live to the beat of his own drum. In 1988, Liam recalls going to a Stone Roses gig with his brother Noel, and he actually claims that if they hadn't gone to that gig together, Oasis never would have formed, because the gig inspired them both so much and gave them a really direct vision for what they wanted to do in life. He says, quote, "That was my favorite gig of all time. Killed me deaf, changed me fucking life. If I hadn't gone that night, I'd probably be sitting in some pub in Levenshulme." The thing that fascinates me so much about Noel and Liam is because of their upbringing and the environment. You know, they, like, I'm just going to say it, they were kind of destined to be deadbeats. They didn't really have a lot of drive or ambition until they found their love for music. And so I do think that despite everything and, you know, the feud and all the shenanigans that the band Oasis got up to, in a way I do think that pursuing music saved these brothers and kind of broke that cycle of unemployment and depression that they would have been growing up in. And Liam is definitely known for being quite brash, unapologetic, and honestly a bit of a dickhead. He does like to say really provocative stuff, and he can also be a little bit short-tempered. He is just himself, you know, he's never ashamed to be himself. And I do find people like that admiring, because I find that I quite often will censor myself around people or just feel like I can't be myself for whatever reason. And then you get people like Liam who are just like, this is what I am, and you can like take it or leave it. And I do admire that kind of energy. There's a great Graham Norton interview, which I will definitely be putting on my Instagram at Mood for Feud. It's so funny because Liam Gallagher is on the couch with Chris Rock, and Liam's got a thick accent, alright? And he's spitting off some story to Graham about like fucking this and fucking that and whatever. And the way Chris is just sitting there looking at him, it's almost like he wants to like clutch his pearls. And I am convinced that Chris is not understanding a single word that Liam is saying in that moment. It's so crack up. You have to watch it. Here's a little fun fact for all my Shameless girlies listening. The character Liam Gallagher in Shameless was actually named after Liam Gallagher from Oasis. Aside from being really abrasive, Liam is also known for his iconic singing stance. He kind of has this pose where he keeps his hands behind his back and he'll kind of be like singing upwards into the mic. And he says he does this because he feels like he can really project his voice well when he's in that stance. But it does make for a really iconic and distinct visual when you see him on stage. It does definitely pull you in. And then the last thing I'll say about Liam is if I had a Twitter account, which I don't have, unfortunately, I would follow Liam Gallagher. He would be my very first follow, because this man has some of the most menacing tweet. He is truly unfiltered on Twitter, and I'll also be posting some of my favorites that I found while I was researching this episode. Alright, I'm going to give a little background into the band Oasis. So Oasis was obviously formed in Manchester 1991, but I found this really interesting. Although Noel was the sole songwriter for Oasis and he was kind of seen as the leader of the band was actually formed by Liam. He took on the role of being lead vocals, and he would also play the tambourine. Remember the tambourine because it does come up again later. And the band was originally called Rain, and Liam formed this band with his friends Paul Arthurs, who was better known as Bonehead on guitar, Paul McGuigan, who they called Gugsy, who was on bass, and then Tony McCarroll, who was on the drums. And of course, 1991 is when Noel Gallagher returns from his trip where he was working as a roadie for Inspiral Carpets. And when he returns and hears that Liam started a band, he's obviously interested in being a part of that. And I think Liam originally offered Noel to be the manager of the band, and Noel declined that. He didn't want to be the manager, he wanted to be in the band. And so after some negotiating, Noel was offered to join the band as the sole songwriter. He would write all the songs for them. He would also be the lead guitarist, and he really wanted creative control of the band. See what I mean? Isn't he just a classic older sibling? Like, that's what I'd do. I'd come into my younger sister's band and be like, no, we're gonna do it my way. Noel basically was like Galleria in Cheetah Girls, you know? He's like, I will be doing everything and you guys will just be following my lead. And the band members do recall that when they met up with Noel Gallagher, he kind of came and he had all these songs already written, and he had a really clear vision for what he wanted the band to be and how they were going to move forward. And so whilst I think the other band members had a lot of talent, they were missing that kind of coordinator, you know, someone to come in and give them a sense of direction, which is what Noel was going to do. And then Noel was really interested in working with this band because he saw them almost as an opportunity or like as an outlet for all the songs he'd just been writing. Because up until then, you know, a lot of his songs he hadn't been able to hear being played by a band with all the instruments all put together. And so I think it did work out to be quite a good deal because the band needed a frontman and Noel Gallagher needed a band. So that's kind of how that all came to be. And then when Noel joined, the name changed from being called Rain to being called Oasis. And the band would play a lot of gigs here and there at clubs. They would open for other, you know, smaller artists around Manchester and wider England. And they eventually sparked the interest of Alan McGee, who was one of the co-founders of Creation Records. And in 1993, Alan McGee signs Oasis under Creation Records. And it's a big step for the band because, you know, under a record label, they're able to get a lot more opportunities to get their name out there and to play a lot of gigs. And Oasis was definitely known worldwide as being a group of hooligans. They very much had that rock and roll type of energy. You know, they did a lot of drugs, they drank a lot of booze, they got into brawls, they started fights, and just lived a very overall hedonistic lifestyle. And I do think that at the time, it was, by a lot of their listeners and their fans, it was almost endearing. Like, their fans loved this about them, that they weren't afraid to live their life how they wanted. You know, they couldn't be controlled. They couldn't be put in a box. And we have to remember that around this time as well, there was a really big, you know, anti-establishment, not wanting to be kept in a corporate box, but like, you know, the freedom to be an individual and to live the life that you want to live. And all of that was really prominent at the time. And so it makes sense to me that even though I read about Oasis in 2024 and I'm like, fucking hell, like some of their behavior is just straight up disgusting, I think at the time people would have been feeling inspired by it. And probably, now I'm making an assumption here, but I'm assuming that a lot of their fans were probably also teenagers and young adults, and the Oasis band members would have been the exact types of people that your parents would have hated and your parents would have wanted you to not look up to. You know, classic as a teenager, that probably drew people into their music even more, particularly people of that age. And so I do think that part of this hooligan behavior that they were known for is also what made them so successful, so memorable, and probably why there are now all these people in YouTube comments saying how much this band meant to them at the time and how much of an impact they had on people's lives. Now, there were a couple of different iterations of the band. So in 1995, Tony McCarroll, who was on drums, left Oasis and was replaced by Alan White. And then around the same time, Gwigsy, who was on bass, was replaced by Andy Bell. And then I think there were some other members. They had a bit of a revolving door of members. I think they even had members who would only be with them on tour, like drummers and, backup keyboardists and guitarists and things like that, that would just play with them on tour. The original Oasis was, Tony McCarroll, Gwigsy, Liam, and Noel. And just to give you guys a little bit of a flavor of what I mean when I say that these guys were hooligans, I'm going to talk about a very, very famous incident that the band went through in Amsterdam. Now, at the time, the band was still relatively new, okay? They'd just been signed with Creation Records, as I mentioned, and their manager booked them a showcase in Amsterdam where they were going to be opening for The Verve. So this was a massive deal for Oasis because, number one, they'd never played a gig outside of England at that point in time, or outside of the UK in that point in time, and so this would be their first overseas gig. And like I said, a lot of these members grew up in Manchester, not from the wealthiest backgrounds, and so for some of the band members, including Liam Gallagher, it was actually their first time being overseas. Which might not sound that crazy to people living in New Zealand or Australia because you have to pay an arm and a leg and then donate a kidney anytime you want to leave the country. But you have to remember, these guys grew up in Europe. Like, you can drive overseas there, do you know what I mean? So it is pretty incredible, and I think it does just kind of show, again, that kind of environment that the boys were growing up in. Oasis heads to their first gig overseas. Their journey starts in a van, and as soon as they hop into the van, they're like, we need some booze and we need some drugs, because they had a 4.5-hour drive from Manchester to Harwich, and then from Harwich they were meant to board a ferry which was going to take them overnight to Amsterdam. So that was kind of the travel plan. And they load into the van and immediately they're like, the 4.5 hours is too long to sit still and do nothing. Like, we need something fun to keep us entertained. But obviously the boys at the time, they don't have a lot of spare money. And so they ask the driver if there's a float of cash allocated for the van ride. And the driver says, yes, there is, but it's meant for petrol. That's what the float's there for. We're meant to spend it on petrol. But the boys quickly convince him to hand over the petrol float, and they spend it on 3 bottles of Jack Daniels and a bunch of drugs. Not sure which drugs. And apparently they did consume all 3 bottles of Jack Daniels during the 4.5-hour road trip alongside some drugs. So by the time the van rolls into Harwich, where they're going to board the ferry, everyone's already pretty loaded up on booze and drugs. Everyone except for Noel Gallagher. I think he was drinking and partaking, but not to the same extent as the other members, because he was keeping level-headed because, this was going to be a really big moment for them. They were about to have their first overseas gig, and he was getting progressively annoyed with the band getting more and more fucked up, because it's like, you guys, we need to stay focused. We need to, again, here's Galleria of the Cheetah Girls. He is getting more frustrated that he seems to be the only one remembering that the reason that they're going on this trip is to showcase themselves overseas and not to just have a party and have a great time on a road trip. So when they roll into Harwich, he is already a little bit pissed off with everyone. They do board the overnight ferry to Amsterdam, and Noel takes himself to bed when he boards. Again, this is an overnight ferry and they're set to play the next day. So he goes to bed, he reads his books, he's having a self-care night, getting ready to play tomorrow. Meanwhile, the other band members are not following suit. They instead head to the bar that was on board. Now, I think when they say ferry, I was picturing like the wrong thing, because this ferry apparently had an onboard casino, an onboard bar, an onboard nightclub, so it was a bit of a like party boat by the sounds of things. And so the band members do continue partying. They're doing drugs in the toilet, allegedly, despite Noel warning them to not sabotage this massive opportunity. They're continuing to buy a lot of drinks at the bar, and they're really hamming it up because they want to celebrate Liam's first time out of the country. I think that was the incentive behind why the boys said they were going for such a big night out. Now, like I mentioned before, the boys didn't have a lot of money at this stage, and so once the petrol float money ran out, they were at a loss. Like, where do we get our next alcohol from? And so that's when Liam and Gwigsy locate the duty-free shop on board of the ferry and steal bottles of champagne to openly consume whilst they're back in the bar. So they're getting drunker and drunker and drunker, and around this time, as they're drinking all the stolen champagne, Tony McCarroll, the drummer, decides to leave because he starts chatting to a German lady that he meets on board. You know, they get talking, and he recounts in his book, they go up to the deck of the boat and he's off having a root. So it's just Gwigsy, Liam, and Bonehead left at the bar. This is where the story gets a little bit interesting, because Gwigsy and Bonehead get accused by bar staff for using counterfeit money. And I will shout out a YouTube video that I watched on the Amsterdam incident. The account is called James Hargreaves Guitar, and the video is titled Oasis, the Amsterdam incident, and I've linked it in my resources below because it is a really good watch, and the guy clearly knows his shit. I think he's read all the accounts from all the different members and then pieced together a timeline of what happened on this boat. But anyway, he describes that Liam claims that Gwigsy had, just before the overseas gig, actually been made redundant, and as part of his redundancy payout, the company that he worked for gave him $5,000 in cash, and that the $5,000 was given in $50 notes. And so that's what they were using on the boat. That's where this money was coming from. And so his story is that they weren't using counterfeit money, and the bar staff were completely out of pocket by insinuating that they were using counterfeits because they were actually just using Gwigsy's redundancy money. Now, James Hargreaves Guitar, the YouTuber, he speculates that Gwigsy had in fact sourced counterfeit money specifically for the purpose of using it on this party boat to Amsterdam. His reasoning for that is the fact that earlier in the story, we hear that the boys didn't have money for drugs and alcohol, and so they convinced the driver to give them the petrol float money. And it doesn't really make sense that they would do that if Gwigsy had a casual 5K that he was willing to blow on him. And then the other kind of weird thing is the fact that Gwigsy and Liam were stealing bottles of champagne from the duty-free because, again, the story is kind of saying that they did that because they'd run out of the float money. But why would they not just use Gwigsy's money? Like, again, it just doesn't really line up. And so this YouTuber speculates that it was in fact counterfeit money. And I think Tony McCarroll, the drummer who's getting a root on the deck of the boat right now, he, I think in his book, admits that it was counterfeit money. But Liam and Gwigsy to this day have never admitted to that. And even in recent interviews when Liam talks about the Amsterdam incident, he always maintains that they were using Gwigsy's redundancy money. Fun little conspiracy theory for you all there. Anyway, they do get accused of using counterfeit money by the bar staff, and security gets called on Gwigsy specifically. And so whilst they're talking to him and, trying to detain him for using counterfeits, Liam gets really upset that they're being accused of this, and he kind of wants to defend Gwigsy and starts a brawl with the security guards. This is around the time when Tony finishes up on the deck, and he comes back down, and apparently it was just like mayhem. The band members were just fighting with security, fighting with bar staff, fighting with other members on the boat, other drunk people. And so he actually just makes a run for it and goes to his room. Now, the boys recall that when Liam was like running around with security being an absolute menace, It almost looked like he was having the time of his life. Apparently he ran to the casino, was just like knocking all the chips off the roulette tables, like smashing stuff as he walked past, pulling stuff down off the walls. Like, he was loving it, allegedly. Which is just like, again, a testament to his character. So I think Bonehead also, like Tony McCarroll, manages to get back to his room before being caught by security, and Liam and Gwigsy are soon trying to do the same thing, but they unfortunately don't quite make it, and so they do get into a bit of a serious punch-up with the security staff before they're both detained. And while Bonehead and Tony McCarroll are in their rooms sleeping, the security actually enters their rooms and takes their passports without their knowledge. And so when they wake up the next day, they recall going to see the staff, like, hey, we're missing our passports. Has anyone handed them in? What's up with that? And the staff were like, yeah, we have your passport. You're not hopping off this ferry and entering the country. You're going to be detained on arrival. So when the ferry arrives in Amsterdam, Gwigsy and Liam have actually been kept in cells overnight for the rest of the ferry ride. So when the ferry arrives, Liam and Gwigsy are brought out of their cells, and then Bonehead and McCarroll are also being like put in handcuffs, and the boys are kind of being like marched off the ferry, and there's police there and they get arrested. Now Noel, who's been in his room this whole time, reading, getting a good night's sleep, doing his self-care night, he just like can't believe what's going on, because he didn't even know about the whole brawl that was happening while he was in his room. And so when they arrive and he's standing with the other passengers who were all allowed to be let off the ferry, and then he just watches the rest of the band members get taken off, he is obviously furious. How are they going to play their gig when his entire band is not allowed to enter the Netherlands? Noel was actually so pissed about this whole incident that he fined each of the band members £500, and they did pay that to him. I think he used the money to like furnish his apartment, he says later. And so obviously the Oasis gig is cancelled, and their manager Marcus is absolutely pissed because he's the one who got them this gig in the first place, and this was meant to be a really big showcase moment for them. And Noel had the unfortunate job of having to call Alan McGee, the co-founder of Creation Records, and explain to him that they would not be able to play the gig because of everything that had just gone down. And Noel recalls that he was really nervous to make this phone call, and he wasn't entirely sure how it was going to go, but apparently when Alan heard what had happened, the only thing he said was, brilliant. And I think it's because Alan knew that there was a market for this kind of band. The band that gets into fights wherever they go are just unlike any other band. Their first overseas gig, they couldn't even play because they were busy being drunk, drugged up, fighting. Do you know what I mean? I think he saw an opportunity to market that. And Alan McGee was right. Even though Oasis never opened for the Verve that night, they almost got way more attention than they would have if they had. There were headlines everywhere talking about this like massive brawl that happened aboard this ferry. And so suddenly, a lot of people are probably getting curious, who is this band and what's their deal, and is getting more invested in their music. So that's a little example, I think, of the kind of band that Oasis was. And now this is also where we get into the feud. The feud kind of first notably takes place when Oasis does their first gig in America. So up until then, the boys had been touring a lot around the UK, and I think at this point they had actually successfully managed to do some Europe gigs, around Italy, Spain, that kind of thing. But they'd never been to America. And at the time, American bands that were of the same kind of anti-establishment 90s rock genre were really, really popular. And so Oasis definitely wanted to tap into that American market because there was a lot of opportunity there, and especially being a British band, they had a kind of point of difference to make them stand out in America. And at this point in time, Oasis had released their debut album, Definitely Maybe, and so the plan was for them to go to LA and showcase this album to their American audience for the first time. Now, before they even get to their showcase, just in the couple days that they're in America leading up to their first gig, they're already causing trouble as per usual. They get kicked off a radio station because they're all excessively swearing. A couple of them get into fights with bouncers at the Viper Room. And then there's even an incident where armed police get called to their accommodation at 6 a.m. because Bonehead, the lead guitarist, was playing their song Champagne Supernova on like full blast. So we're already seeing some like classic Oasis behavior, and they haven't even got to their first gig yet. Now, 29th of September 1994 is when they're performing their showcase gig, and they're performing it at Whiskey A Go Go in Los Angeles. And Whiskey A Go Go is a venue that's really famous for launching a lot of music careers. For example, Led Zeppelin, The Who, and The Doors are all bands who had one of their biggest like showcasing moments at Whiskey A Go Go. And so this is a huge opportunity for Oasis because this will either like make or break them in the American market. Now, the day before they were set to perform this showcase gig, one of the crew members for Oasis gets tasked with finding some drugs for the band. And I think what the band were after was some cocaine or ecstasy, you know, MDMA type of vibe. They wanted some like powders to snort. And the crew member, obviously they're in a foreign country, they don't have their usual connections that they would be used to. And the crew member accidentally brings back methamphetamine, which, I mean, these are both Class A drugs, I'm pretty sure. But yeah, methamphetamine is a lot stronger than like cocaine, for example. So this crew member brings back methamphetamine, thinks it's cocaine. The band all does a fat line, and the crew does as well. And that's when they're kind of like, oh crap, this is not cocaine, is it? Like, it kind of hits them that what they've done is just something a lot stronger. But it doesn't deter them. They continue to snort a lot of lines. And so the band and the crew are like all hooked up on meth. By the time it rolls around to the next day, they haven't really slept a lot. They have to keep continuously snorting to like maintain their alertness and not hit like a big drop and a come down. And so apparently the next day when they're setting up to perform, they actually have lines of methamphetamine drawn up backstage so that mid-performance the crew and band members can go back there and like stay loaded up on drugs, which is just absolutely wild to me that was happening. Now obviously Noel Gallagher like clicked on pretty quick that what they were taking wasn't cocaine and decided to lay off it as best as he could. And so he was probably the only one somewhat functioning when they started playing their showcase. But I think the biggest issue here is that having the band jacked up on meth is like not great, but then having the crew also incapable meant that their showcase gig became an absolute disaster. Apparently the crew gave the band members different set lists, and so each band member was kind of under a different impression of what order the songs were going to be played in. And you can hear this. This gig is up on YouTube, by the way. And when their first song starts, you can just tell that they're not all playing the same song. And at the same time, they're just really out of sync with one another. Liam's singing is a little bit off, and then Noel's harmonizing is like completely off. This is not their best performance by any means. I mean, the crowd is still going wild, so at least they had that going for them, because I feel like if I went to a gig and the band started playing like that, it would just be crickets. Yeah, they're definitely not playing their best. Like I said, they're playing out of sync. Liam's like threatening the crowd at certain stages because someone tried to like tip over his microphone, he thought. And then in some of the songs, Liam's just sitting down and not singing because he can't be fucked. He's over it. He just needs a little moment to rest. And so Noel's having to sing as lead vocals for some of the songs because he's just Siebes. It was a disaster, to say the least. And Noel is obviously fucking pissed. Because, again, like I said, Noel's all about wanting the boys to take this a bit more seriously. And this is their first American gig. They're at an iconic venue that's known for making or breaking music careers. So the fact that they're going up here and bombing this hard not because they're not a good band, but because they're all jacked up on meth, is like fucking frustrating. And apparently at one point Liam starts insulting the band and tells Noel to go fuck himself, because I think Noel is very much showing that he is angry at them for the way that they're bombing on stage. Liam would have been feeling so I can imagine, would have been feeling so pissed. He does get really angry at Noel, and he actually chucks his tambourine at Noel's head. Which, remember how I said that he, as well as being lead vocals, was also the tambourine? The tambourine becomes a weapon very quickly. Noel is obviously pissed off about this whole thing, and he walks off and he goes AWOL for like a couple days. Nobody knows where he is. Nobody knows what he's doing. But when he does finally like cool off and come back to the band, he's written a song, Talk Tonight, about the whole incident. And in this song we get the lyrics, sitting on my own, chewing on a bone, 1,000 million miles from home, when something hit me somewhere right between the eyes. Again, Noel is such a songwriter. He just needed to isolate himself and then channel all that anger and all that pain into another opportunity for Oasis. And from here, it becomes blatantly obvious to the public that these brothers do not get along. In November 1995, we get the release of Sibling Rivalry, which is an interview that got burnt onto a vinyl and CD and was being sold. And in this interview, Liam and Noel are having a like really intense fight. And the interview was so popular that it actually charted. Isn't that crazy? Like, Sibling Rivalry charted in the UK charts because so many people were buying the vinyl and buying the CD that had the two brothers squabbling on it. And the front cover of Sibling Rivalry actually has a photo of the brothers Ronnie and Reggie Kray, which they were kind of these mob brothers. All the Tom Hardy girlies will know who these people are because Tom Hardy played these twins in a movie called Legend, I believe. But yeah, it was kind of comparing them to these brothers who also quite famously had a big rivalry. I get tempted to play clips from YouTube and TikTok in this podcast all the time, but you're not allowed to without permission. But oh my god, I want to play Sibling Rivalry so bad. So just please go to my Instagram so you can hear this fight, please. Or look it up yourself on YouTube if you're not going to follow me on Instagram. It's fine. You have to hear it. It is actually really funny. You definitely need subtitles, but I definitely found myself laughing a couple times because the incident that they're arguing about is actually the Amsterdam ferry trip that I detailed earlier. And in this interview, Noel is very clearly frustrated with the fact that everywhere Liam goes, he just starts fights and does a bunch of drugs and gets up to a bunch of shit. And then Liam's kind of going like, fuck you, man, that's rock and roll, you know, that's rock and roll. And then you've got Noel going like, getting thrown off a fucking ferry is not rock and roll. Rock and roll is about the music. And he's getting so frustrated because he's just like, why is Liam not grasping that if you want to be good at rock and roll, you kind of have to be good at music. You can't be good at music if you're off getting into fights all the time. And yeah, I definitely think that everyone just needs to go listen to this because I can see why it charted. It is truly entertaining. Now, in May 1995, Oasis is recording their second album, What's the Story, Morning Glory, at the time. And, you know, like I said, Noel was the driving force behind Oasis. He wrote all their songs. He had full creative control. And so he was spending some long hours working at the studio, writing, you know, figuring out all the chords, the whole shebang. And Liam decides to bring a massive group of people back into the studio while Noel is trying to work. And so he's getting pissed off with Liam because he's like, hey, like, I'm trying to freaking get shit done. Why did you just bring all these people back here? It's such a distraction. And the two obviously start fighting. Don't get me wrong, I imagine they were both drunk and probably on some drugs at the time. And Noel reportedly picks up a cricket bat and hits Liam over the head with it, which is insane. So yeah, again, that sibling rage that really just brings out the most violent characteristics in people. I can't remember who, but somebody who's in the studio at the time, I think it's their producer, actually takes the bat home with him and then writes like a letter of authenticity for it. And then this bat gets sold at auction. and I couldn't find how much it sold for. I tried so hard to find this information, but I guess back then, not everything would have been documented online. On the 23rd of August in 1996, Oasis was set to perform an MTV Unplugged show in London, but Liam pulled out short notice because he was kind of complaining that he had a sore throat and so he couldn't sing on stage. So Noel decides to step up for lead vocals in the Unplugged show, and he announces, quote, "Liam ain't gonna be with us because he's got a sore throat, so you're stuck with the ugly four." I think Liam was, as the lead singer, kind of known as being the quote-unquote hot one in the band. I think that's why Noel makes that joke there. But the interesting thing about all this, Liam's not at home resting his throat or, at the doctor's trying to get better. Liam is actually watching from the crowd and spends the whole time heckling the band whilst they're playing their Unplugged show. So I think fans in the audience were just really confused, like, what the hell is going on here? Another time the two were reportedly fighting was in May 2000. They were set to play a show in Spain, which got cancelled when the drummer at the time, Alan White, had injured his arm. And so the show gets cancelled, and, what do Oasis do when they don't have a gig on? They get drunk. And obviously an argument breaks out between the brothers, and then Liam starts to question the legitimacy of Noel's oldest daughter, trying to sow some seeds of doubt there, trying to say that Noel isn't actually the father. And so Noel does start to attack Liam, the two have a fight, and Noel actually leaves the band, and Oasis continue the European tour without him. Now, in the next few years, there are instances of both of the brothers leaving the stage, leaving tours, leaving concerts for various reasons, like vocal issues or just because they're having a fight. Sometimes Noel will just disappear for weeks at a time without notice. Sometimes Liam will just walk out of a show, mid-show, he'll just walk off stage for whatever reason. So you can tell that it's not a very great environment for these two to be in, and it's obviously taking a massive, massive toll on their relationship as siblings, but probably also on the other band members. I can actually imagine it would have been so exhausting being in Oasis and just being around that kind of behavior all the time, where people just have tantrums and then start fights and then walk out. I think you couldn't pay me enough to be the manager of this band. I feel like I would have no hair left by the end of that. I should actually look up a photo of their manager and see if they're bald, because that must have been the most stressful time. Can you imagine the amount of insurance coverage that they'd have to pay for? Because which venue would want to sell tickets for a band that may or may not show up, or could pull out for any reason, or could pull out mid-concert even? In October 2005, Noel gives an interview with Spin magazine. At this time, everyone's figured out that the two brothers don't get along, and so they do quite often get asked about their relationship and about, whether they're still fighting or whether they've resolved things or whether they'll ever resolve things. And Noel says, quote, "I've kind of learnt that instead of arguing stuff out with him and ending up in a fight, I work on his psychology, and he's completely freaked out by me now. He's actually frightened to death of me." So the band's continuing to play, but things are just getting worse and worse and worse. The two brothers are constantly bickering. Even on social media, they're now bickering a lot. Like I mentioned, Liam Gallagher has a really iconic Twitter, so Noel is definitely not an exception when it comes to people that he calls out on his Twitter account. And the brothers are definitely on a decline at this point. And in 2009, everything kind of comes to a head when Oasis is set to play at the V Festival, and the band cancels because Liam has laryngitis. That's the reason for why they cancel their show. However, Noel later publicly claims that Liam didn't have laryngitis and he was actually just hungover. And so the reason their show got cancelled is because he was irresponsible. And Liam was so pissed off that Noel was going around saying this that he actually took legal action and he sued Noel for libel. But I think later Noel did apologise, and so the legal case was dropped. But we're kind of seeing that these two have always been bickering and always been going off at each other. But it's getting to a point where they're getting super unprofessional with it. And they're also starting to take each other to court. In 2009, Noel does an interview with Q magazine, and when they ask him about Liam, he says probably the most famous quote to come out of this whole feud, which is, he's the angriest man you'll ever meet. He's like a man with a fork in a world of soup. And I can see why that quote blew up. And that is the only thing that I knew about this feud before looking into it this week, was that quote. He's like a man with a fork in a world of soup. And then around this time, Noel starts to kind of discuss that he thinks his life would be easier without Oasis. Now, on the 28th of August 2009, Oasis were prepping to go on stage at the Rock on Sun festival in Paris, and again, Liam and Noel start arguing, and Liam grabs one of Noel's guitars and starts swinging it around like an axe, trying to hit his brother with this guitar. And so the show was cancelled that night, and the rest of the tour was cancelled that night. And then Noel issued a statement saying, quote, "It's with some sadness and great relief to tell you that I quit Oasis tonight. People will write and say what they like, but I simply could not go on working with Liam a day longer." So I think that whole guitar fight is where Noel actually drew the line and was like, I can't keep living like this. Noel makes another statement a few days later titled Tales from the Middle of Nowhere, and in this he says, "The details are not important and of too great a number to list, but I feel you have the right to know that the level of verbal and violent intimidation towards me, my family, friends and comrades has become intolerable, and the lack of support and understanding from my management and bandmates has left me with no other option than to get me cape and seek pastures new." From that quote, I'm guessing that the rest of the band were absolutely pissed that Noel had quit. Because remember, he'd left the band for periods of the time previously, right? And him and Liam had gotten into squabbles and he'd walk off for a couple weeks, but he always came back. And I think when he gave this public quote telling everyone, I've had it and this is over, they were kind of realizing oh crap, he's actually left the band for good now. In later years, Noel started to reveal kind of what led to that argument that then prompted Liam to grab Noel's guitar and start hitting him with it. And apparently it was because Liam had advertising for his clothing firm, Pretty Green, in the V Festival program. So that's what Noel initially says the argument was about, but then in later years he ends up going on Radio X and giving an interview where he says, quote, "I had enough when Liam and Bonehead, and this is true, started arguing over a leather jacket. I'm not even kidding, I can dress it up more than this, but this is what happened." So it's a little unclear, and I will say Liam and Noel's memory is a little bit hazy, as you can imagine, after years of drug and alcohol abuse, and so it is really difficult to tell which parts were true. So I don't know, either the argument started because of this ad that Liam had for Pretty Green, or it started because Liam and Bonehead were fighting over a leather jacket. Either way, he says in his original statement it was a myriad of things. It wouldn't have been an isolated incident. And then later in 2009, Liam announces that he's starting a different band with some of the former Oasis members, and they're going to be called BDI. And BDI did last until 2014. I think it does go to show that Liam was in the end capable of being in a band without his brother Noel. And then in 2010, Noel launched his solo career when he played a show for a teenage cancer trust in London, and he has continued that solo career all the way till present day. And like I said, BDI, which was Liam's new band, were playing all the way to 2014, and BDI was set to play at the Olympics closing ceremony, and they wanted to sing Wonderwall, but obviously Wonderwall is owned by Oasis, and so Noel alleges that the organisers had to get his agreement for BDI to play the track because he's the songwriter for Wonderwall, and he says, quote, "I did play a bit of cat and mouse with them for a few days. I took till Friday night at 10 o'clock before I said yes." And the band was set to play on Sunday, so they were obviously shitting themselves wondering whether they were going to be able to play at the closing ceremony or not. And even in recent years, Noel and Liam both continuously get asked about the feud that they have with one another and whether Oasis will ever return. Noel once said, quote, "We are split up. You've heard that, haven't you? You must have heard. Yeah, so ergo, band splits up, band is no more. There is no band. So no, I won't be getting involved anyway. If there is a reunion, I won't be in it." And Noel has kept true to his word. Oasis has not reunited since then. Sometimes, occasionally, Liam will kind of hint that he's ready for a reunion. Maybe if it was for charity or for $250 million, he says. But I think for now, at least my understanding is that there won't be an Oasis reunion in the near future. And I think the reason behind that is because in Liam's mind, Noel is the reason why Oasis broke up. And so in his mind, he probably sees it's Noel's responsibility to bring them back together. And he kind of hints at that in a Radio X interview where he says, quote, "I didn't leave Oasis. Noel Gallagher left Oasis. He couldn't handle the vibes anymore. He couldn't handle the rock and roll. He was too scared of it. So now he's gone all cosmic pop and Leo Sayer." And I wholeheartedly believe that statement because, as we know, Liam Gallagher's definition of what it is to be rock and roll is to get thrown off a fucking ferry. And then I think from Noel's perspective, he probably wants some kind of apology from his brother or some kind of acknowledgement of the shit he was getting put through and some kind of recognition that Liam has grown from all this as a person. As recently as 2023, Noel Gallagher was asked on the podcast Table Manners what it was like working with family, and he says, quote, "It's your greatest strength and greatest weakness. Strength because when family members sing together, it's like an instrument you can't buy, so it immediately becomes recognizable on the radio, and you've got great rapport and connection. It made Oasis what it was. But at the same time, it was its Achilles heel. It eventually broke the band up because you can push each other's buttons and you tend to revel in it." And then the girls on Table Manners ask him, "Did it upset your mum, the fact that you were always fighting and still to this day don't get along?" And he says, quote, "I'm 55. You think I give a shit about what my mum's got to say about anything now? She couldn't even control me when I was 14. So yeah, to me it doesn't seem like there's ever going to be some kind of reconciliation. But that is the end of the feud. Let me know what you think. There was a lot to unpack here. Like I said, this ended up fascinating me way more than I ever expected it to, and I feel like I've become a bit of an Oasis fan after looking into this. So yeah, I've been listening to some of their songs all week, and I'm definitely getting the charm that people felt back then. They are definitely an interesting group of people. I think my closing thoughts on this are just the fact that I can kind of see where each brother is coming from. You've got Noel Gallagher, who's I guess the more operational man, I guess, within Oasis, and he's finding it really important to write songs and take things seriously and, strive to be the best musicians that they can be. And for him, rock and roll and Oasis is purely about the music. And then Liam, on the other hand, is like, rock and roll is a whole attitude, it's a whole lifestyle, and music is part of it, but so is being these people that don't give a shit and move to the beat of their own drum. And I will say, I think both brothers are right here, because obviously you need the music to be your backbone. That's going to be the product that you sell and the product that accelerates your fame. But I have to say, the reason that Oasis blew up a lot of the time wasn't because of their amazing songs that they were singing, but because of the attitude that they had and the way they were always in the headlines for causing shit. Noel is the rock and then Liam is the roll. I think you need both to be as big as Oasis was at the time. Not endorsing any of their behavior. Let me know any of the thoughts you have. As always, remember to rate and review the podcast if you're enjoying it. Follow me on Instagram at moodforfeud and hit me up in the DMs if you want to talk about this or any other pop culture related stuff. Otherwise, I will see you all next week. I hope you have a great week ahead of you, and go and hug your siblings. That's your homework for this week.